Hello everybody, James here. Today we got quite a few big news stories that I'm really excited to share with you guys all. We actually have 4 different clinical trials that we're going to be talking about. We have 2 MindMed clinical trials, we got a Compass Pathways clinical trial, and we got a microdosing clinical trial. But before we hop into it, if you guys enjoy this episode, sacrifice 4 seconds of your time to the almighty algorithm god. It's the best way to support this channel through your like, through your comment, and through your subscribe to the channel. Alrighty guys, without further ado, let's hop right into it. I am going to go ahead and put up on the screen the first clinical trial that I want to talk about right now. So as you can see, it is the Compass Pathways clinical trial, and actually the very first thing that I want to mention is it's not in fact a Compass Pathways clinical trial, but rather it was one that was done by the King's College of London. The second thing to point out, as you can see here, is it was actually completed in 2019, although it's taken 2 years to get the data out. So the trial itself is not new, but the data is, at least new to people like us. So this was, let's just talk about, I guess, the structure of this trial first. So first things first, it was a phase 1 clinical trial. There was a relatively large sample size with 89 healthy individuals, and those were split into 3 different groups. 1/3 got 10 milligrams of psilocybin, 1/3 got 25 milligrams of psilocybin, and 1/3, of course, got the placebo. Now, something that's really interesting to mention here is that in the design of this trial, it was not done on your typical 1 therapist, 1 patient, or 1 volunteer model. Rather, they allowed up to 6 different volunteers that were taking psilocybin to be in the room at the same time, although there was still some 1-to-1 support. Now, this is important because this allows for scaling up of psilocybin therapy. As we've talked about before in the past, one of the biggest barriers for psilocybin therapy going forward will be the ability to scale it up. If you are undergoing a psychedelic experience for 6 to 10 hours and you need to have a therapist there with you the entire time, that is going to be very expensive. And if we can have instead 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 individuals in the room at the same time, even if there is that 1-to-1 support, it will make the cost of psilocybin therapy much less, make it more accessible, and make this a more realistic treatment option. So, because this was a phase 1 clinical trial, it is important to note that this was not attempting to treat a specific malady, say depression. Rather, the purpose of it, like all phase 1 clinical trials, was to test safety. What's interesting about this phase 1 clinical trial, however, was it was looking at a specific subset of safety, and that was whether or not there were any detrimental cognitive effects or emotion processing negative effects, either after the treatment finished or long-term after, which they define as a 12-week follow-up. Just as a little side note, I don't really know if 12 weeks is long-term. I would call that like medium-term or something, but whatever. That is just nitpicky. So there were 2 important findings in this clinical trial, or let's say 3 important findings. First was, it was safe. Now, that's not really a surprise. By now, we've seen enough psilocybin phase 1 clinical trials and phase 2 clinical trials to understand that in all likelihood, taking psilocybin is relatively safe for those who do it. Of course, we're not 100% yet, but we're pretty close. We're at like 90+% sure of this. Now, looking into the specific subset of safety that they were looking at, let's just go ahead and read part of this press release. It says, the results also showed there were no short or long-term detrimental effects on thinking patterns or processing of emotions. So this was a victory, perhaps not necessarily an unexpected victory, but a victory nonetheless. Taking a look at the quote from the study's lead author, Dr. James Rucker, he says, this rigorous study is an important first demonstration that the simultaneous administration of psilocybin is worth exploring further. If we think about how psilocybin therapy, if approved, may be delivered in the future, it is important to demonstrate the feasibility and the safety of giving it to more than 1 person at the same time, so we can think about how we scale the treatment up. So right there, Dr. James Rucker was just explaining what I was saying earlier, albeit perhaps a tad more eloquently. The second important takeaway from this clinical trial, this phase 1 study, was something that's not actually even mentioned in this press release. We have to go ahead and take a look at the actual scientific paper to see this, and by the way, this was published in the prestigious Journal of Psychopharmacology. So if we just scroll down on this a little bit, we can see that it mentions that there were no serious treatment-emergent adverse events. That's what the TEAE stands for there. Now, this is important because in the phase 2, the flagship phase 2B clinical trial that Compass Pathways released data on a couple months ago now, they had several emergency adverse events. So let's just scroll down here. This is the press release they put out for the data for their phase 2B clinical trial. If we scroll down to the findings, we can see that in the 25 milligram group, 5 patients had what they called treatment emergency serious adverse events. And in the 10 milligram group, 6 patients had this treatment emergency serious adverse events. Now, the data that we're looking at today is important because it just adds to the total number of patients that we can look at to see how frequently we get treatment emergent adverse events, or in the phase 2B case, emergency events, serious adverse events. And when looking at this one, there might be a couple of obvious explanations. The first one is that this clinical trial was trying to treat people with treatment-resistant depression, meaning everybody in this trial already had a very serious form of depression, so serious adverse emergency events such as suicidal ideation and thoughts of self-harm aren't necessarily unexpected in this population of people. So perhaps it is just a function of the people that this trial was done in. Although the counter-argument to that would be, if we see here in the control group, which only received 1 milligram of psilocybin, there was 1 patient as opposed to 5 or 6 that had a treatment emergency serious adverse event. So it does imply perhaps that was due to the psilocybin, or perhaps it was due to the structure of the trial. There are lots of different reasons behind this, or possible reasons, and they would all just be speculation on my part. But what is important here, the point that I'm trying to drive home here, is that in this new COMP360 trial, or the new data rather, we once again saw that there were no serious treatment adverse events, and that repeats something that we saw in another open label trial that used COMP360. Not sure where it says it here, so I'm not even going to look for it, but in that small trial, they also found no emergency adverse events, so that's just adding to the pile of information that we have. Moving on, we're going to take a look at the next trial that I wanted to talk about today, and this is a new upcoming trial that MindMed is going to be doing, or more specifically, it's going to be the Lychee Lab at the University Hospital Basel, Switzerland, that is running this clinical trial. As you can see here, it's not yet recruiting, so we are in the very early stages here. It is going to be a phase 1 clinical trial, and it's going to be very small. There's only going to be 24 participants to it. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up, even though there hasn't been a press release on it yet or any sort of publication on it, it's just been posted on the clinicaltrials.gov website, is, well, frankly, it's pretty interesting. What they're doing is they're combining LSD and SSRIs, which is the standard treatment for depression, to see whether or not it's safe. So it's a phase 1 clinical trial, so the main purpose of it is safety. And this is important because we need to know whether or not patients who have been on SSRIs for their entire lives, or 2 years, 10 years, whatever have it, if they can remain on their SSRIs when undergoing psilocybin, or in this case, LSD therapy. So we're attempting to treat different conditions like depression and anxiety using psilocybin, using LSD, but if you've been on an SSRI for a decade, you can't really just stop it like cold turkey like that, because there are going to be withdrawal issues, there might be some addiction issues, there might just be general pharmacokinetic issues that happen from immediately seizing a medication that you've been taking for years and years and years. It might be better to wean yourself off of that substance, or continue taking it even while on the LSD. The only issue is we have no data on this, so we need to know whether or not it's safe. In the recent past, we've actually seen 2 studies that looked at whether combining psilocybin and SSRIs was safe. So this one was from MindMed, very small study, but they found that they were able to successfully combine psilocybin with SSRIs. They found that it did not have any negative effects, and in fact, it may have even reduced some anxiety and increased blood pressures associated with psilocybin, so it might have even been more effective. However, again, this was a small study. There were some procedural issues with it. Robin Carhart-Harris, for example, called out on Twitter how the amount of time that people that were taking the SSRIs was very short. It was only a few weeks, which would have limited the amount that we could extrapolate from this data. Compass Pathways also had a study, and this was the one I was actually looking for a second ago and couldn't find, that also showed that there were no serious adverse events when taking psilocybin. But what this study did was they combined psilocybin COMP360 with SSRIs, and again, they found that there were no treatment-emergent adverse events in this study, and no treatment adverse events related to suicidal ideation or behavioral or intentional self-harm. So good news on that front. Getting back to the current study here, the LSD one that MindMed is running, hopefully we will get similar results in this study using LSD as we did with psilocybin. And this is just important because it gives us more options. And frankly, we just need the most data possible. We're still in the very early stages of whether or not or how exactly we want to structure psychedelic therapies. So any and all data that we can get on how to best structure these clinical trials is great, and that's essentially what this is going to do. It's just going to give us more data. So the way this trial is going to work is there's going to be 2 groups, the placebo group and the regular group. Both groups are going to take the LSD, because it's not testing the LSD. What it's testing is the LSD in combination with the SSRI, with the paroxetine, which is the type of SSRI that they're using here. So those in the placebo group are not actually going to have the SSRI. So that's what's being compared here. And the main endpoint of the study, what they're looking for, is the subjective effects on consciousness, which is cool. That'll be fun to read about. But what I think is more important here is this one secondary endpoint, which is, of course, the safety measures. So we need to see whether or not combining the 2 is safe. My gut is telling me it is. If psilocybin looks like it's safe, then probably LSD with SSRIs will also be safe. But again, we need to see. We need to see the data. And then once this data comes out, there's only 24 participants. So only 12 people receive both LSD and the SSRI. So obviously we're going to need larger trials in the future. Regardless of what this says, this will just be a very first baby step. Next up, the next trial that I want to talk about is another MindMed clinical trial. Let me find it here. Here we are. And I am super excited about this one because MindMed has finally successfully completed their phase 1 clinical trial for 18MC. Now, when we first started this channel about a year and a half ago, we talked about 18MC a lot because I was very excited about it, but unfortunately, there hasn't really been much news on it in the past half a year, so we haven't really brought it up. So for those of you who are perhaps a little bit unsure what exactly 18MC is, I'm just going to give you a quick rundown of it. So long story short, there is this psychedelic compound that is called ibogaine that comes from the iboga shrub, which can be found in West Africa. Now, this substance is extremely hallucinogenic. It can cause hallucinations that last longer than 24 hours in some cases. However, it's also been found to be an effective treatment for certain addiction issues, specifically opioid addiction. And this is important because we frankly don't have any great treatments for addiction at the moment. So if ibogaine can be an effective treatment for addiction, again, we need to test this in rigorous clinical trials. But if it can, then that's just another toolbox or another tool in our toolbox that humanity has to conquer addiction, which is one of the main issues facing our society right now. Now, despite all this, there are some issues with ibogaine. 2 of them, actually. One, as I said, is the intense, very long hallucination. If you want to pay a therapist to watch over you for like 24 plus hours, you're going to be paying out the wazoo for that. And then second, some studies have also shown that there are some negative cardiovascular side effects of taking ibogaine, or perhaps a better way to phrase it is there may be some negative cardiovascular side effects with ibogaine. So what MindMed has here with their 18MC is a next generation of ibogaine that they claim is three things. One, still effective in treating opioid use disorder. So yay, awesome. Two, non-hallucinogenic. So that's great. You don't have to have the 24-hour hallucination. You can take the medication at home. You don't have to go see a therapist. And three, is that they say they don't have the same negative cardiovascular effects. So again, everything I just said needs to be tested in phase 2 and 3 clinical trials, needs to have a huge population tested on hundreds of people, perhaps thousands of people before we can confirm any of those statements. But we are starting to be able to test this because we have finally finished the phase 1 clinical trial. Now, they have expanded the scope and scale of this phase 1 clinical trial over the course of 2021, increasing the dose levels that individuals are receiving so that we can get as much data, safety data, as possible. And now, finally, this phase 1 clinical trial is over. As we can see here, we can expect top-line results in early 2022. We're in early 2022, so hopefully we're going to be getting this any week now. Perhaps it will still take a couple months. I guess an argument could be made that March or even April is still early 2022, so we might still be a few months away, but still very, very exciting. And even more exciting is once we get this data, we will finally start the phase 2A study in individuals with opioid withdrawal. Now, this is what we're waiting for, is this first test case of whether or not 18MC can be an effective treatment for opioid withdrawal. And if it can, if in the phase 2A study it's shown it can, and then in the phase 2B study it's shown, and finally in the phase 3 study, then MindMed is going to have a really big winner here. So this is just a really important update for you guys. The phase 1 clinical trial has finally ended. Alrighty, the last study that I want to look at today is a microdosing study. Now, y'all know I love that microdosing. I love the potential for microdosing. I love the companies working with microdoses, so I'm excited to share this study with you. This is a brand new phase 2 study that's going to be happening at the University of Toronto, and it is using the proprietary psilocybin formulation of a company called Filament Health. Now, I'm not exactly sure if I've mentioned Filament Health on the program before or not, but for any investors out there that are interested in doing a little bit more research on the company, their ticker symbol is FLHLF on the OTCQB and FH on the NEO Exchange. Now, like I said, this isn't exactly a Filament Health clinical study. This is a University of Toronto clinical study, but it is using Filament Health's medicine, so if it's effective, it will obviously be a boon for Filament Health. So I guess before getting into the details of this clinical trial, I'll just spend a moment talking about why microdosing psychedelics is such an exciting avenue. In many anecdotal stories, and we're talking like thousands and thousands, not dozens, and then also cross-sectional studies, so not placebo-controlled, not the greatest controlled studies, but still, it has been found that psychedelic microdosing, specifically LSD and psilocybin, can increase creativity for individuals. It can improve your mood. It can regulate your emotions. It can get you into states of flow. It has all of these potentially really positive benefits that can help not only people suffering from specific ailments such as ADHD or depression, but also potentially can just be an all-around quality of life booster for anybody. Now, having said that, the science is definitely far from definitive on this. We haven't really had almost any great controlled studies on it, and the extent to which we do have legit science done on microdosing, psychedelic microdosing, the results are very mixed. So there is the famous one that was done by Robin Carhart Harris and team at the Imperial College of London, which of course showed that microdosing was likely to be mostly due to the placebo effect. And give me a second, guys, because I'm just going to check to make sure my mic is even on. Maybe I've been doing this entire thing without my mic. It looks like it's on. I think we're good. Anyhow, microdosing. Yes, studies that have been showing that microdosing, studies up until this point have been inconclusive, or they have butted heads with each other. So we just don't know, frankly, whether or not microdosing is due completely to the placebo effect or whether or not there is something to microdosing. And we just need as much science as possible to get to the bottom of this, to figure out whether or not microdosing is the placebo effect or a wonderful, wonderful humanity-boosting potential drug that we could even get over the counter sometime in the future, 5, 10, 15 years from now. Of course, first it will be used, if it's successful, it will be used for things like adult ADHD, for depression, but eventually it could make it into the wider landscape. Alrighty, having said all of that, let's just take another brief look at the current study, which has not started. It is set to begin. It's set to start recruiting, so we're not going to get any data from this for a while, but nevertheless, Health Canada just approved this phase 2 clinical trial. Again, it's happening at the University of Toronto, and it's using PEX-010, which is Filament Health's version of psilocybin. It is, like I said, placebo-controlled and phase 2, expected to begin soon, first quarter of 2022, and it actually has a pretty decent sample size. There's going to be 100 healthy subjects in this, so probably half of them will be placebo, and half of them will have psilocybin microdoses. And it is specifically attempting to treat a form of depression, which I actually don't see. Oh, here it is. Persistent depressive disorder. So hopefully we will get some great data back from this, and we can get a phase 3 clinical trial on psilocybin microdosing, and then 10-15 years from now we can just go to the pharmacy and pick one up for ourselves. Again, that's definitely getting ahead of myself, but you never know. Just to give a quick recap, today we looked at updates on 4 really cool clinical trials. First was a phase 1 study looking at the safety of COMP360, Compass Pathways' proprietary version of psilocybin, and that found that it was safe, and also there were no short or long-term detrimental effects on thinking patterns or processing of emotions. Second, we looked at a new study that has not yet begun that MindMed is going to be running, looking at combining LSD and Ssris. Again, this hasn't yet begun. It's going to be phase 1. It's going to be a safety trial, but that will help us structure future clinical trials for treating people with anxiety and depression and other issues to figure out whether or not it is safe to continue using Ssris in that process. Third, we looked at an update on the MindMed clinical trial for 18MC, their version of ibogaine to treat opioid use disorder. They finished their phase 1 clinical trial. They're going to be publishing data on it relatively soon, the early 2022, and they're going to be starting a phase 2A trial attempting to treat opioid use disorder, or opioid withdrawals rather. And finally, we got this microdosing study done using Filament Health's version of psilocybin, which again is called PEX-010. It's being conducted at the University of Toronto, and I am super duper excited for this. If you enjoyed this episode, you already know what to do. Like, subscribe, comment down below. Let me know if you are excited by the sheer scope and scale of clinical trials that we are seeing right now, because literally in one day we got updates on 4 different clinical trials. This is just exploding, guys. We have so many clinical trials in the psychedelic space happening right now. It's going to soon be impossible to keep track of them all, so that just really excites me. I want to know if it excites you. Comment down below. Alrighty, guys, if you enjoyed it, like, subscribe, comment, all that. I think I already said that. Going crazy, losing my mind. Awesome. Peace.